Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me again. Again, let us um, devote our learning for the zchus of our soldiers, their success, refuah shlema to everyone who's been injured, and to all the civilians, and to, of course, all those who are kidnapped and are victims languishing now in Gaza. We pray that they will be rescued and that this current situation will be resolved in the best way possible. We're in God's hands on this, and Yetz Hashem, things will turn out to be better, and we'll come out the other side of the tunnel to a better future than even we went in. But meanwhile, we're somewhat of a mire. We're rather stuck, and please God, we'll find our way forward. We should have the patience to endure. I'm going to go over a piece of the Gemara that we did last week because it will enable us to go further. We always have to go a little bit back in order to go a bit forward, so that we have the train of the arguments and also the characters who the Gemara is discussing. So we're here on Masechet Yuma, Daf Tet Amud Beis 9b. And I'm going to start about 10 lines from the bottom, which is a shtickle we did actually do last week. It's very interesting Gemara, and it goes back to discussing the situation during the two Botei Mikdash, the first Beis HaMikdash and the second Beis HaMikdash. In particular, whether there were differences in the Averot and the transgressions that led to the destructions of the two, and we do know that that the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed primarily because of transgression of the cardinal sins, the Avodah Zarah and Gilui Arayos and Shvichas Domim, whereas the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because of Sinat Chinam. And we're still in a period now of recovery because we haven't seen the third Beit HaMikdash. We're still languishing following the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. And the Gemara asked various questions about whether the people who came back after the after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash to build the second Beit HaMikdash, whether they were greater people than those earlier on, the previous generation. And there were indicators that they were better, indicators that they were worse. After all, even if we're great Talmidei Chachomim nowadays, which we all aren't, but in the Talmudic times, post-destruction, it didn't bring about sufficient merit for the reconstruction of the Beis HaMikdash, so that with all the virtues of those who returned in second Beis HaMikdash times, it wasn't sufficient to rebuild. With all the Torah that was created and became widespread, which was not the case during the first Beis HaMikdash times. The second Beis HaMikdash period and onwards was a period of much greater scholarship. Nevertheless, it seems to have been lacking in that the proof of the pudding is that there has been no rebuilding of the second Beis HaMikdash. After its destruction, it remains as it was, and we have no further revival in the fully religious sense. We have a national revival, but not so much a religious revival. We're going to take this Gemara now from 10 lines from the bottom. We're into this topic, talking around the topic of the return from Bovel after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash into the second Beis HaMikdash period. So let's start with the words Reish Lakish. It says Reish Lakish. It's in the middle of the 10th line from the bottom. In the middle, Reish Lakish havi sarchi b'yardana. So I said this is something we said before. We'll go over it a little bit more quickly than we did it last time. There were a lot of interesting aspects here we covered. I won't go into those in quite as much detail now. Reish Lakish havi sarchi b'yardana. Reish Lakish was swimming in the River Jordan. I said to you that we know Reish Lakish was fond of swimming in the river. He's first found, if you like, as in his earliest days as a bandit which was the beginning of his life, a bandit, and he was swimming in the river when he met Rabbi Yochanan. So Reish Lakish here, many years later, when he's already an established Talmud Chacham, is having the swim in the Jordan. And Asa Rabba Baba Chana, and you have Le Yoda. Rabba Baba Chana, excuse me, Rabba Baba Chana, who was a Babylonian Amora, who was visiting Eretz Yisrael, and he became a Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan in Eretz Yisrael, but he hailed from Bovel. This is after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. Yehav leYada. He stretched out his hands to help Reish Lakish emerge from his swim. So he gave him a hand in assistance. And you'd have thought Reish Lakish would be very grateful. Reish Lakish is already getting old and he needs some support. But instead of thanking him, Omalei, Reish Lakish said to Rabbi Bar Bachana, rather shockingly for us, Elaha, oh my God, if you like, Sanin Alechu, I hate you people. This is what he says to Rabbi Bar Bachana, who himself was a Talmud Chacham. Why does he hate him? So if you read the commentary, and if you also see the continuation of the Gemara, the story becomes obvious. He says, I hate you people because you're a Babylonian. I don't have anything against you personally. But the fact is that you have been in Bavel all this period and just come over now to Eretz Yisrael after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. If you had have come much earlier on, in other words, if your ancestors had come very much earlier on, then we wouldn't be in the situation we are now. But you and your ancestors remained in Bavel and only came in the last few years to join us here in Eretz Yisrael. You did not come back with Ezra when he sought to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. You were your family was one of those families that remained behind in the luxury of the Euphrates River in Bavel. Rather than coming down, only a small number of people came down. We know that the book of Ezra tells us that only about 42,000 Jews actually came down from a much bigger number in Bavel. The rest stayed in Bavel, and the 42,000 rebuilt Eretz Yisrael and started the second Beis Hamikdash. And it was a poor reflection of what it had been before, primarily because the numbers coming down were a poor reflection of the numbers who were in Eretz Yisrael. It was a small ragbag set of survivors who came down. They weren't either the creme de la creme of Babylonian Jewry. Rather, they were the lower class who felt that life in Bavel wasn't so great after all, and that they would try their hand, if you like, in Eretz Yisrael. So Reish Lakish is pointedly referring to this when he talks to Rabbi Bar Bachana. You Babylonians remained behind for much too long. Dichsiv, and he quotes a posuk here, rather than just meaning to deliver a history lesson. He also quotes a verse, which he interprets as a criticism of those who remained behind. And it's a verse in Shir HaShirim, which I looked at with you last time. Clearly, it's the verse is taken from a song in Shir HaShirim, and it doesn't literally mean what Chazal will interpret it to mean, but we will be Doreshet, or rather Reish Lakish will. And the verse is, Im chomahi nivne oleha tiras kosef, ve'im delas hi notzu oleha luach ores. And Reish Lakish will proceed to explain the meaning of this verse. And I shared my screen with you last time, and we'll go back to look at the verse again. You should be seeing the verse over here. Im chomahi, this is in Shir HaShirim, nivna leha tiras kesef, im dalas hi netzor leha luach eres. I've separated the two phrases. And the translation here taken from Safari, if she be a wall, she be a wall. Essentially, this is all referring to this mysterious woman in Shir HaShirim, but we are going to obviously deconstruct the posuk to mean something different. If she be a wall, we will build upon it a silver battlement, tiras kasev. If she be a door, imdeles, a wooden door, we will panel it in cedar. Tzoraleha luach eres, a plank of cedar wood. We will panel it, we will veneer it with cedar. The posuk itself is fairly meaningless, other than it can be translated. It doesn't offer us a message. But Reish Lakish proceeds to do so here in the Gemara. And he says the following, Im asisa atzmachem kachoma, going back to the Gemara. I'll just stop sharing for a moment. Here we had the words choma, by the way. If she is a wall, then we associated that with, I would say, a palace of silver rather than battlements of silver. But if a door, if she's only a door, then we will just plate her, or we will veneer her with cedar wood. Just remember that, and I will stop sharing. I'm sure you all remember that. So here we are again. Let's go back to the Gemara. This is the interpretation of Reish Lakish in his Agadic interpretation. If you had made yourself like a wall, what does it mean like a wall? A wall made of firm bricks, not wood, but what a wall used to be at those times was a stone wall or a brick wall, let's say a stone wall, where all the walls of all the stones are firmly wedged into place without gaps, and a wall that is not capable of being toppled over very easily. If you had done that, the verse is saying, then that would mean Va'alisam kulachem bimei Ezra, and all of you had come up at the time of Ezra to help in the project of rebuilding Eretz Yisrael, and you hadn't remained behind. If you had come up like a wall, which means if a large number had come up from Bavel, all of Klal Yisrael who were then in Galut, then you would have been like a wall. You would have been firm, and then your reward would be Nimshaltem kakesef she'ein rakev sholet bo. Then you would have been like made of silver, which is not subject to rotting or to any deterioration. The silver will last forever. However, that's not what happens, says the Reish Lakish in his drasha. The Achshav Sha'alisa Kadalotot, it said, but if you were to come up like Delet, like a door, now that you actually came out of Bovel, like a door, what does that mean, like a door? It means essentially a scatterbag of people who came up. You were like a wooden door, the difference between a wooden door and a stone wall. A wooden door doesn't take up punishment so much. It is subject to rot, it is subject to being worm-eaten, etc., etc. So after a while, a wall begins to deteriorate. So you came up like doors. Another way of looking at dalotos is from dal, from weak. You came up all weakened. You were just a small group of individuals rather than the whole of the exile in Bovel. And as a result, Nimshaltem Ke'eres, you are to be compared to cedar wood, which is actually quite strong wood, but we'll see in a moment, to only a thin veneer of cedar wood, Shaharekev Sholet Bo, which is subject and vulnerable to rot, to damp, to wind, to worm, etc., and easily eaten up. So what is the moshel and the nimshal over here? This is the way Reish Lakish is looking at this. He's saying that had the Babylonians come up in force from the Galut to Eretz Yisrael to begin the rebuilding project with Ezra and Nehemiah and so on, then they would have been like a wall that was almost impregnable, and they would have been like silver that never rotted. In other words, they would have been a Shechina in the second Beis HaMikdash, which ultimately there wasn't, and it might never have been subject to decay and destruction. Why was the second Beis HaMikdash so flawed? Why was there no Shechina in the second Beis HaMikdash? Many of the great perspectives that were around during the first Beis HaMikdash of God's glory being manifest in the Beis HaMikdash were not there during Bai Sheni. Why? Because just a small set of people came up. They were just like a wooden door with a thin veneer. Because they came up, they were subject to rot and decay, and the second Beis HaMikdash is destroyed. So here we have Reish Lakish, and this is the Musa Drasha. He gives Rabbi Bar Chana. Rabbi Bar Chana didn't live during this period. He was never there to come up during Ezra's time. He is a descendant of his family who had stayed in Bovel, whereas Reish Lakish had always been in Eretz Yisrael, came from an Eretz Yisrael family, so to speak. There he says that my ancestors were here, if you like, when we built the state, so to speak, says Reish Lakish, whereas you were on Chutz Loretz. You wanted to stay with the flesh pots of the Babylonians, and you didn't come down. Do you know something? He says to Rabbi Bar Chana, had your family come down together with everybody else, we would never have seen the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. We saw the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash because it was simply a poor reflection of the first Beis Hamikdash, because just a poor proportion of Babylonian Jewries came down. So this is a critique which Reish Lakish has launched against Rabbi Bar Chana. It's not a personal critique. It's very much from a national perspective, and it's the same perspective maybe people have today. Those families who have been in Eretz Yisrael many generations and whose kids are in the army, etc. Not the kids of recent Olim or whatever. They're bound to say that an Oleh has had it easy. He's come over here. They didn't go through the 48 war. They didn't go through the 67 war. They didn't go through the 73 war. If you'd been there much earlier on and built a state, we would have had a stronger state, and there wouldn't have been a 73 crisis. We can say all sorts of things. There's certainly parallels between the accusations here of Reish Lakish to Rabbi Bar Chana and some of the accusations you might hear from a long-time Israeli to his Olah, his recent arrival Olah, Johnny come lately counterpart. The Gemara is looking here a little bit at the symbology of the word Erez now. This is really just an aside. My Erez, why are we using the expression here, Erez Sida? In the Posuk it said that you came out up like doors, and therefore you're like Erez, which is subject to decay. Why does it say Erez? So Ula says Sasmagar. We don't really know what Sasmagar is. It means apparently the type of cedar which is just a thin lacquer, not really a thick upright cedar tree, but a thin lacquer which is somewhat worm-eaten perhaps, and it's really like the outside shell of the cedar. And that's really all we were when we came out of Bovel. And this was a great loss to the future potential of the Jewish people. They could have been so much more if they'd come up in so much great numbers. And Omer Rabbi Abba explains this idea of a thin veneer of the Sasmagar, not just in terms of, if you like, the moshel to a small number of Jews who came up in Bovel, but also to the future. As a result of only a small number of people coming up, they were only a thin veneer of themselves. It's not just that they were only a thin veneer of themselves, but their connection with God was a thin veneer of what it had been earlier on, when the first Beis Hamikdash was standing. So during the second Beis Hamikdash, there was only a thin veneer connection. And he explains himself over here, Rabbi Abba, Baskol. It means that all that was left in terms of the communication channel, if you like, between the Jewish people and HaKadosh Baruch Hu was just this Baskol, this slight echo sound of a voice from heaven that gives some sense of direction to the Jewish people. But what was lost was prophecy. Prophecy was lost, and prophecy was the strong line of connection that was there during the first Beis Hamikdash. And again, the implied criticism is that if the people had come down in large numbers, fully from Bovel, to begin the construction of the second Beis Hamikdash, then prophecy may not even have been lost. That may have continued the line of a much stronger connection. But it was lost because they came down in such small numbers. Kidatanya, and this is in accordance with a brisa that says the following. It's a famous brisa. Mishimesu neviim ho'acharonim. When the last neviim died, who are Chagei, Zachariah, and Malachi, the last three neviim, who are already transitional into the second Beis Hamikdash in Eretz Yisrael during the early stages of the second Beis Hamikdash. After that, there were no more Nevi'im. From then on, Nistalka Ruach HaKodesh in Israel. This concept of Ruach HaKodesh, this line, this channel of divine messaging, which really we're referring here to is Nevuah, Nistalka, departed from the Jewish people. But nevertheless, they had this thin veneer of a connection left, the sasmagon. What was that? The bas kol. And I talked about the bas kol last week. The bas kol is the occasional voice that perhaps very great people may hear, which instructs them how they should carry on. We never sure we have a bas kol. We may serve a bas kol today. We don't know. Maybe some of our sages still have a bas kol. There was also the type of bas kol, which is, if you like, a resonant feeling, which all of us may sometimes have about what we should be doing, which is like a personalized bas kol. The Gemara uses the word bas kol sometimes in this general broadcast sense that a Jew has if you like, an instinct suddenly that something would be right rather than something else. He has an instinct that this is the decision they should make. And that could be a form of bas kol. We don't actually have a heavenly angel flapping its wings. We don't have a direct conversation, but there's some sort of a sporadic conversation that we have from heaven, some sporadic message. And that is called a bas kol. And it's only the slightest echo of a nevuah. And that is all that was left following the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. I should go on actually say that there is another line which the Gemara brings elsewhere to explain the departure of Nevi'im at the time of the first period of the second Beis HaMikdash, the last three being Chagei, Zacharia, Malachi. And the Gemara elsewhere, I think even in this Masechta, says the following. It doesn't attribute it to the fact that only a few people came down from Bavel to Eretz Israel, but rather says that when the second Beis HaMikdash was built, the Jewish people were at a weak ebb. They were defending themselves against the Samaritans. The Persians several times told them to stop, start. We know what a troubled period it was. It took a long while for them to rebuild the walls and to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. The people did not have a high level of emunah yet. Ezra had to try and separate the returnees from their non-Jewish wives, as we know. So there was a lot going on, and there were a lot of flaws in the Jewish community. And as a result, also, the Jewish people felt they might fall victim again to the same sins that had brought about the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. What's to stop this all happening again? I mean, they're allowed to go back now. Presumably that means that in some way they've expiated the sin of the generation of the first Beis HaMikdash. However, they may fall into the same bad ways. And in particular, they felt that Avodah Zorah might be something that would rear its ugly head in a big way. Avodah Zorah was one of the three cardinal sins that brought the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. In Persia, there was a lot of that going on around them. And now that this ragbag group was rebuilding the second Beis HaMikdash, they essentially prayed for the strength to ward off the example of Avodah Zarah that was still around them and the heathen practices. And it says they prayed for the removal of Avodah Zarah from the world. And the Gemara says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, had Rachmanis, and said, yes, the Yetzer Hara at that time for Avodah Zarah was so strong that it was almost irresistible. And as a result, Hashem removed Avodah Zarah by flicking his finger. I mean, there's a very vivid Gemara that describes how this happened. But essentially, with the sort of heathen practices died out slowly after, even across the Roman world to some extent, certainly not to the extent they were during first Beis HaMikdash times. The later on were more legend-like rather than real belief in idols and stuff like that, or in strange gods of fire, etc. So Avodah Zarah was lifted in order to make the life easier for those returnees and less likely they would be trapped again in their bad old ways as idol worshippers. And the Gemara goes on to say, and this is a very important fact, that we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sets up challenges according to the level of the individual. A person who's a great individual will have a high-level challenge to deal with, because the low-level challenges are no challenge. And in order to maintain an equilibrium of free will, that is, the choice between the good and the bad, the good has to seem attractive, and the bad has to seem attractive even to great people, which means the challenge they have has to be increased. And we know that is often the case, that good people feel their Yetzer Hara stronger. The Gemara says that. Given the case that the Yetzer Hara of idol worship was removed, something else had to fall at the same time. That was Nevuah. Let me put it differently, the other way around. During the first Beis Hamikdash, where there was such a strong Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu endowed the Jewish people with prophets. And the prophet, if you like, was the balancing positive against the terribly painful negative of Avodah Zarah. Prophecy was the holy connection with God, which was at a much higher level because the unholy connection through Avodah Zarah, that Yetzer Hara, was so strong. That one has to correspond with the other in order to maintain Bechira. Now that Avodah Zarah was taken away during the early Bai Sheni period, it was not necessary anymore to have that level of Nevuah. Yes, so as a counterbalancing negative, really, because of the positive moving Avodah Zarah, the virtues, the glory of full-fledged prophets was taken away from them, and all they had left was this thin veneer of a bat kol. They didn't need any more than that in order to maintain a balance between a person's choice between the good and the bad. So that's a slightly different view of the epoch at which prophecy was removed, a different reason for it. Over here, the Gemara seems to allude that it was more attributable to the fact that people who came down from Bovel during the return to Eretz Yisrael really came down in small numbers. It was half-hearted, and it wasn't the sort of return that was called for. The people in Bovel erred in remaining where they were, and this is the criticism that Rabbi Bar Chana receives from Reish Lakish. Okay. Interesting Gemara. The Gemara now goes on, actually interesting, because it's going to go on to a biographical, almost an editorial question, which is going to ask itself, which is very unusual. The Gemara now says, Reish Lakish mi mishtoi bahadi Rabba Bar Chana. Did Reish Lakish really have a chat on the riverside with Rabba Bar Chana? The story I gave you was that Reish Lakish was swimming, and then Rabba Bar Chana, this Babylonian, extends his hand to help him emerge from the river, which means the two were in conversation over here. Rabba Bar Chana said, "Can I help you?" Reish Lakish says, "You're going to help me? Your ancestors fought it all for us, etc., etc." So there was a dialogue between the two. The Gemara now suggests that there could not have been a dialogue between these two individuals, Reish Lakish and Rabba Bar Chana, for a very, very strange reason. It's not because they were not contemporaries. They were contemporaries, but somehow we wouldn't have expected Reish Lakish to talk to Rabba Bar Chana. Why not? So let's go on with the Gemara. Reish Lakish mi mishtoi bahadi Rabba Bar Chana. Did he really engage in conversation with Rabba Bar Chana? Uma Rabbi El Oza, that's what it should be. Demora de Arad Yisrael have if already Rabbi El Oza, who was one of the leading Amoraim in Eretz Yisrael at the time of Reish Lakish and Rabba Bar Chana, and he was considered to be Demora de Arad Yisrael, if you like, the glorious master, like Morad Asra, of the whole of Eretz Yisrael. Even a person at that level, the low Hava Mishtor Reish Lakish Bahadei. Reish Lakish would not even engage him, even the great Rabbi Elazar, into conversation. Now the Gemara is going to give you the reason, and it's perplexing. Why not? Demand the Mishtor Reish Lakish Bahadei Bashuk Yahavule Yiska Below Sadei. Because anyone in conversation with Reish Lakish in the marketplace, what that means is in the open, in the public view, anyone speaking to Reish Lakish in public view, Yehavule Iska Below Sadei, the merchants in the market would always give him business on credit, if you like, without any witnesses. So Badi Rabba Baba Chana Mishtani, if you won't even speak to Rabbi Elazar, will you speak to Rabba Baba Chana? What does this mean? Not clear. So the Mefarshim talk about what it might mean. What is it that Reish Lakish was afraid of in terms of speaking to people in public? So one explanation over here seems to be Reish Lakish would engage in very few dialogues. And maybe some say maybe we're only talking about non-Torah affairs rather than Torah affairs. There's a lot of discussion of what this really refers to. You know, how broadly was this sanction against talking to people that Reish Lakish seemed to hold, but he didn't talk to people in general. And why? Said the Gemara. Because anyone who was seen speaking to Reish Lakish would immediately be given credit, if you like, in the marketplace. So according to one explanation, I'm not sure this is the right explanation, Reish Lakish didn't want to talk to anyone because the person he was seen to talk to would then automatically be given, you know, business, perhaps without credit, without repayment terms from someone in the market. And Reish Lakish didn't want any merchant then later to have a time to say, well, you were speaking to this person, I thought this person therefore was reliable, but he hasn't paid me back. So rather than fall into wrongly flattering someone simply by being in conversation with him, which might lead to somebody dealing adversely with him in business, he rather kept his mouth shut and didn't talk to anyone. So therefore nobody would be flattered by speaking to Reish Lakish because he doesn't speak to anyone, everyone's equal. This is very, very strange. So he wouldn't even speak to Rabbi Elazar publicly, and Rabbi Baba Chana, being a lesser character, certainly wouldn't speak to in public. There are other explanations here as well, but let's just suffice with that explanation. So how could Reish Lakish have been engaged in this dialogue with Rabbi Baba Chana if Reish Lakish does not indulge in dialogue? So Omer Rav Papa seems to accept this criticism of the story and the names in the story, and essentially says, yes, we have heard the characters involved in this exchange incorrectly. He said, he uses lovely language here, Shtei Gavra Benayo, throw a man in it, in between them. What does that mean? So he explains what he means, really. Oh, Reish Lakish Hava, if you say Reish Lakish was the guy swimming in the river when this dialogue took place, which is what we said, then Uzairi, then Zairi was the person who was trying to give him a hand to help him out of the river, and not Rabbi Baba Chana. We'll see why in a moment. Oh, if you say that Rabbi Baba Chana was the man giving a hand to the person in the river, then the person in the river wasn't Reish Lakish, but Rabbi Elazar. It was Rabbi Elazar who was the one who was swimming in the river, and not Reish Lakish. So essentially, Rav Papa is saying, I agree. Rabbi Baba Chana does not match up in terms of the dialogue with Reish Lakish. There are two things you can do. You can either say that it wasn't Rabbi Baba Chana who was helping him out, it was Zairi, and Zairi was known to be a person who did converse with Reish Lakish, and then you have a viable story. Or if you insist that Rabbi Baba Chana was extending his hand to help, then it wasn't Reish Lakish in the river, it was somebody else that Rabbi Baba Chana was helping. That would have been Rebbe Elazar, who was also a very great senior person. Over here, therefore, the Gemara has decided that you need to substitute one of these characters in order to make this story, if you like, believable or viable. But if you keep with Reish Lakish and Rabbi Baba Chana, then you have two people who probably would not have been seen speaking to each other. Okay, so that's an aside. I say it's been interesting over here because we weren't talking here about a historical mismatch. Sometimes the Gemara, and certainly the Mefarshim, will say, you know, when the Gemara talks about Rabbi A speaking to Rabbi B, is that possible? Surely Rabbi A lived 120 years after Rabbi B. They would never have spoken to each other. That's a common question. But historically, they could not have been in association. However, over here, it's more a question of, you know, would Reish Lakish really be speaking to anyone almost? You know, this just wasn't his habit, except perhaps to one or two select individuals, of whom Rabbi Bar Chana was not one. Okay, so that's this little story over here. Now it actually, in a sense, carries on, and this is now a completely different perspective. Interesting, we're going to get from Rabbi Yochanan. Ki also lakamed Rabbi Yochanan. When it seems Rabbi Shlokish maybe came before Rabbi Yochanan, and he explained what he had said about the Babylonians. Remember, Rish Lakish, the one who said, you know why we're in such shtuk now after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, why the second Beis HaMikdash had to be destroyed, etc. Because those Babylonians didn't come down in big enough numbers. And because they didn't come down in big enough numbers, we were left with only a thin veneer of a populace in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore a thin veneer of the Shechina, and therefore the whole second coming, if you like, into Eretz Yisrael was due to come to a sad end. It had to come to a sad end. It was on its way to a rot, and that's where we are now. Had they come down in a bigger number, then everything would have been fine. So Rabbi Yochanan says, not at all. Rabbi Yochanan is essentially going to say, don't accuse those Babylonians for not having come down as being the cause of the lack of Shechina, for example, in the second Beis HaMikdash, and its imminent path down to demise. Don't accuse the Babylonians for that. It's true, they should have come down in larger numbers, but even if they had, it wouldn't have helped. This is Rabbi Yochanan says, Amalei, lav hainu taima. Your reason you've given is not the reason why we are where we are today in the year 200 and something after the Common Era. Because inami sliku kulahu bi'mei Ezra, even if every last Jew, says Rabbi Yochanan, had come down during Ezra's period, together with him, so the whole of the Golus Babel had returned in force, like a wall, like a stone wall, an impregnable stone wall. Even then, lo havasharia shechina b'mikdash sheni, there still wouldn't have been a shechina during the second Beis HaMikdash time. It still would have lacked some of the finesse that was there during the first Beis HaMikdash. Why? And he quotes a pasuk for the reason. Dichsiv, because the pasuk says, and this is a pasuk in this previous week's parsha, which we know, so it's really appropriate to learn its meaning now. Yaf Elohim leyefes v'yishkon ba'olei Shem. This is Yefes was one of the sons of Noach, Shem, Cham, and Yafes, and from these three, all the nations, if you like, following Noach emerged. And Yefes was, if you like, the progenitor of Greece, as we'll see later on. The Gemara will talk about it. And Yefes had some great strengths to it, because we see later on, Chazal admired in many ways Greek civilization in terms of its intellect and its openness, but at the same time condemned it because it was godless and it was heathen. But there were aspects of Greek poetry and Greek language which were very attractive even to the Chazal. So this is how they learn the pasuk. Yafta lehim leyefes. Hashem, if you like, has endowed Yefes, if you like, Greece, not Persia at the moment, but Greece, with beauty. A beauty which is not to be found even amongst Shem and amongst Ham. And the Jewish people are actually descended from Shem and not Yefes. So this is a compliment to Yefes. Yafta Elohim leyefes, v'yishkon ba'olei Shem. Nevertheless, he needs to dwell in the tents of Shem. Now, this is one of these mysterious psukim. Let me just share the screen with you. I'm not sure we need it for this fairly basic pasuk. Here we are. Now, the translation here is wrong, of course. Yafta lehim leyefes. So Safari translates it, may God enlarge Yafeth. Where that came from, I don't really know. Anyway, Yaft means beautiful, beauty, glory, splendor. That's what Yaft means. Yafat, it's the same word. V'yishkan ba'olei Shem, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. And then it says, v'hi Canaan eved lomo, and let Canaan be a slave to them. We're not interested in this third expression here. The just Yaft Elohim leyefes, v'yishkon ba'ahalei Shem. And if we go back to the Gemara and see how Rabbi Yochanan wishes to interpret it in terms of the second Beis Hamikdash, because at the moment it seems that there's no relationship between Rabbi Yochanan's objective to show that the second Beis Hamikdash was failing as a result of this pasuk. He wants to show this pasuk is where the second Beis Hamikdash was failed on. It did not comply with this pasuk. So let's read what he has to say. Because Vishkan ba'ahalei Shem, what does it mean? It means, and here we move on to Yud Amud Aleph, if you're following the Gemara, right on the top of 10a. Af al gav de yaft Elohim leyefes, even though God granted glory to Yefes, nevertheless, ein hashchina shora ela ba'ohalei Shem. The divine presence will only shine in the tents of Shem. Now, what does this mean? So the interpretation of Rabbi Yochanan over here, because the Gemara doesn't explain this further over here, is that the second Beis Hamikdash, what you might say was built by Ezra and Nehemiah, etc., but it wasn't. The whole inertia towards building the second temple came from the Persian Empire. So whereas the first Beis Hamikdash was built by David and Shlomo, and it was entirely a project of the Jewish people, in other words, Shem, because David and Shlomo are Semites, so therefore they descended from Shem, it therefore was blessed with the Shekhinah, because the Pasuk says, V'yishkon ba'ahalei Shem. V'yishkon means he shall dwell, but Yishkon also has the root of Shechina. The Shechina will only be ba'ahalei Shem. So when the Beis Hamikdash is built and managed entirely as a project through the descendants of Shem, then V'yishkon, Hashem's Shechina, will dwell there. And the first Beis Hamikdash was such a period. However, the second Beis Hamikdash was essentially not built by the Bnei Shem. We're saying that you could attribute it to Cyrus, to Koresh, and therefore it was a Persian project. Difficult to say this, but that's how the Reish Rabbi Yochanan understands the Bayis Sheni. And because it was essentially all, if you like, it was financed and even guarded by Persians right at the beginning when they first came down to build, it was essentially a project of Persia. The understanding is that Persia is descended from Yefes. Persia is from Yefes. So we'll see, the Gemara will challenge this in a moment, or we'll discuss it, but the presumption here is that Persia is Yefes. Of course, Persia is Greece, but we're talking about the grander picture of Yefes, and Yefes extends beyond Greece. It extends even to Persia. And therefore, if Persia is Yefes, then the Shekhinah is not going to rest there. Even though Yacht Elokim leYefes, even though Yefes, Greece, and even Persia does have, in a sense, a status of being upgraded over Cham and Canaan, for example, nevertheless, that upgrade isn't sufficient for the Beis Hamikdash. It means that it produces aesthetics, it means it produces philosophers, it produces artists, it produces poets, it'll produce architects, and so on. And that is the Yefes, that is the beauty of it. It produces a beautiful language and a wonderful literature. That's Yacht Elokim leYefes. But ultimately, where's the Shekhinah going to lie? Not in Yefes, V'yishkon ba'ahalei Shem. It'll only lie amongst the tents of Shem, the Ahalei Shem over here being used, if you like, as a moshel for the Beis Hamikdash, the tent like Ohel Moed, the Beis Hamikdash, which has been built by Shem. So says Rabbi Yochanan from here that even if all the people had come down during Bayis Rishon, during Bayis Sheni, wouldn't have helped. The Shekhinah wouldn't have been there because Bayis Sheni was essentially a project not of Shem but of Yefes. Persia was Yefes, whereas the Shekhinah will only rest in a place which is the project of the Jewish people. The third Beis Hamikdash will be the project of the Jewish people, not something. It won't be the United States sending its materials over and its battleships over to protect the third Beis Hamikdash. That would be another project of Yefes. That's not acceptable. It has to be one in which the Jewish people are in command of their own destiny. So that's how he explains his position over here. Just one out of interest, again, when we look at this posuk, Yaft Elohim leYefes, Chazal learn it. One of the ways they learn it, which is very interesting, is that a Sefer Torah, theoretically, a Sefer Torah can be written in Greek. Why? It's outrageous. Should only be written in Lashon HaKodesh. Says the Gemara, no, the Mishnah. Can be written in Greek. It can't be written in English or French or German or anything. Can be written in Greek. Why? Yacht Elohim leYefes. They quote that there's a certain yofi. If it's not going to be written in Ksav Ashuris, as we have it in block Hebrew print in the Sefer Torah, an alternative is it could be written in Greek because of Yacht Elohim leYefes. So we are seeing a level of upgrade in what we understand to be Greek civilization over here, that we're allowed to write a Sefer Torah in it. Aesthetically, it's good enough. We don't like their philosophy. Maybe we don't like their the heathen nature of some of their beliefs. But when it comes to making use of those aspects of Greek culture that would be useful in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then it seems that we can make use of Greek because of Yacht Elohim leYefes. I don't know if anyone ever wrote a Sefer Torah in Greek. It's not something you will actually find anywhere, any fragments of. We're not here talking about the Septuagint, by the way. There's a bit of confusion over here because the Septuagint was a Greek translation, if you remember, 200 BCE or whatever. It is in Alexandria in Egypt. It was a first translation into Greek. However, that's a Greek translation according to, if you like, the intention of those who translated it. And it's not the translation, it is a translation. So the Septuagint isn't really a Sefer Torah written in Greek, even though you could say it's very close to that. Another a consideration over here is, what do we mean by Greek? So I have heard it said that there's a difference between the ancient Greek, which might have been acceptable to Chazal, and modern Greek today. Well, I have no idea to what extent it's true. Is it true of the script at all? Is it true only of the nuances of the language? Is it true of the structure and the grammar? I don't know. But that's another thing they say. When we say Yacht Elohim leYefes, who says it means today's Greek? We don't write our Sifrei Torah in modern Ivrit. We don't change the words from biblical Hebrew to modern Hebrew and then, transpose that and read it in the Sefer Torah. We have it as it is. So if we have ancient Greek translating literally, as far as possible, a Sefer Torah, then maybe that would be an acceptable Sefer Torah. If you find such a Sefer Torah, you'll make a fortune, I'm sure. Okay. The Gemara now asks this question, and the Gemara we're going to go into now is a very strange piece of Gemara, which is going to be a bit difficult to understand, only because the names that it brings up are so unfamiliar to us, and they are also very confusing. The Gemara is now asking the question, where do we know from that the Persians who built, so to speak, or masterminded the project of building by Sheni, are descendants of Yefes? How do we know that? Maybe they're descendants of Ham or Shem. We have Shem, Ham, and Yefes, and we had different generations. And we're going to quote a psukim from Noach again, which gives you the names of nations that descended from the sons of Noach. And we're going to look at these names, and we're going to try and find or identify Persia. If we can't identify Persia as one of the sons of Yefes from Parshas Noach, we have no raya, we have no evidence that Persia is essentially Yefes. So let's have a look. A second, I've just on these silly notices on my screen. I'll share screen for this verse, which is, and I'm sure you're very interesting. Let's start with this one. It's not the posuk the Gemara is going to bring. It's a posuk after this. Elo Todas b'nei Noach, Shem Cham v'Yefes, Vayivoldu lahem bonim, Acham Abel. Right. So these are the lines, the sons of the generations of the sons of Noach, who are Shem, Cham, and Yafes, and these were sons born to them after the flood. So who descends from who? So now I'm bringing you B'nai Yafes, because we're only interested in the descendants of Yafes. Who are Yaphetites in terms of the nations they flowed from? So says the Posuk, Gomar, Magog. People always remember Magog. It's, oh, yeah, Gog and Magog. Actually, who Magog is, where Magog is one of the biggest mysteries. So even though it's a name you know best, it's the place we know least. Umadai, V'Yavon, V'Subol, Umeshech, V'Siros. Well, it doesn't help us, does it, very much? But let's go on. So let's just see. So he says the descendants of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. So this particular map over here, which I don't think is terribly useful, but I'll put it in anyway. English Art Scroll seems to think this is a masterpiece, so I've taken the liberty of photocopying this. And this is a map of the ancient world, as per maybe the way in which the Romans have seen their ancient world. And there were lots of powers at the time. Maybe this would have been true during Babylonian, slightly earlier Babylonian times. I just point out, there are some names here that are very familiar, others which you know because you've just read books which bring them in, but they're not empires that exist anymore. So you see over here, Gaul, that's France, it says, actually France and Germany, I think to some extent. Here's Germania, that's Germany, and we'll see Germania appear later on. And you have Scythia, you have Macedonia, which is where Alexander the Great came from, the north of Greece. You have Thrace, you have Mysia. These names may well come in to the way we interpret the Psukim. So this is all like Turkey bits, there's sort of what we call Turkey, maybe, I don't know, Yugoslavia, or we don't know. Bithynia, Phrygia, which says over here is Turkey. So modern day Turkey will be a lot more than this little bit over here. So generally speaking, the modern names we have are partly to do with some of the map we see here, but not necessarily covering the same territory. And over here you have Assyria, you have Babylonia, you have Persia, which is going to be to the right of all this, and Media. The Medes and the Persians, are mentioned together. Modai or Paras, as we see in Megillas Esther, they're mentioned often together. And there's Parthia. These are, and now, Bavel afterwards, when it really came on top, took most of this area away from Assyria. So this is really, if you like, the core Assyria, the core Babylonia before it expanded. As we know, we had Assyria, then we had Bavel, and then we had Persia. All these empires went head to head against each other, all taking over each other's territories. So to some extent, this is all a billboard. It's all one big confusion of territories. And then you have Arabia over here, and this was called Africa. Nowadays, Libya, Mauritania, I'm not sure these names were even known at the time. Africa, all right, so Africa was just Africa. Now you've memorized all this. Now let's try and see what it does for us. So I'm going to go back to these territories one at a time. B'nai Yefes. So the first one was Gomer. Most scholars, but not all, on any of these things, there's going to be multiple opinions. But I'll just give you one set of opinions so you can go away happy. Gomer is G, if you make the resh before the mem, it's Garam, and maybe it's Germania. Anyway, that's not the reason. They want to say that Gomer is Germany. And therefore, we have, and the Gemara will say that, and we go back into the Gemara itself. I'll read you what the Gemara says. You can keep looking at the map rather than looking at the Gemara. The Gemara says, Gomer ze Germamia. Germamia. Germamia, I think the Vilna Gaon and others say, is Germania, which is Germany. So Germany is one of the descendants of Yefes. Yes, so Western civilization is descended from Greek civilization. So here we have the first one, which is Germany. I just bring out of interest, there's a very, very famous Gemara in Megillah that says this about Germany. This was said about 1600 years ago. But Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak said the following, what is the meaning of this pasuk in Tehillim, I think? Al titein Hashem ma'avaye rosha, zamamo al tafek yarumu sela. Rabbi Yitzchak said, what is the meaning of this pasuk? Do not grant the wishes of the evil doer. Make sure that you don't remove its muzzle. Do not allow its muzzle to be removed, lest it will become exalted. So what's this talking about? So Amar, he says this is the meaning. Amar Yaakov lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ribbono shel olam, al titein le'esav harosha tavas libo. Don't give Esav, my brother, the capacity to fulfill everything he desires. Zamamo al tafek. Do not remove the muzzle, which is muzzle, M-U-Z-Z-L-E. I don't mean muzzle in terms of luck. Don't remove the muzzle that is preventing this Russia from biting and consuming, because if you do, it'll become a dangerous, all-consuming tyrant. What is that referring to? Zu Germania shel Edom. This is referring to the nation called Germany. She'ilmole hein yotzin, if they ever were allowed to escape from their muzzles, machrivin kol ha'olam kulo, they would put swords to the whole world. Remarkable Gemara that foresees the nature of the German people, that if you were to remove their muzzle, they will go out and remove and destroy the world. Anyway, so that's Germania. If I go on with a posuk over here, the next one is Magog. Well, where's Magog? As I say, Magog, the best known, is the least known. So some say, so the Gemara says, Zu Candia, which turns out to be Crete. It seems highly unlikely. So others say, what are you talking about? We're talking about Magog. If you look at the Nevi'im, they say Magog will come from the north. They don't say Magog will come from the east and it's a tiny little island. Magog is this ghastly territory which will make war against Gog, or its leader will be Gog, and it'll make war against Israel. It sounds like a superpower. So it must be some power around here somewhere, you know, around the Babylonian world rather than Crete. So we don't understand what Magog is. And then the Gemara says, and this is where the Gemara is wrong, according to the other Girsos, which you have in your text may be wrong, Modai zu Macedonia, that Modai is Macedonia, which seems ridiculous. And so therefore another version of this Gemara says Modai kamashmo. Modai is what you know Modai to me, it's Media, the Medes and the Persians. It's not Macedonia. And then our Gemara says Yovon kamashmo, Greece means what you know it to mean Greece. Yovon means Greece. And then, oh, mummy. Right, it won't come back. 1 second. I've got to stop.
Oh, now I can hear you.
Oh, are you back with me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I lost you for a moment. I know, I'm sorry. Magog, so it can't really be Crete. Modai is Media, and then Yovon, our Gemara says Yovon Kamashma'o, but actually it should say Yovon zu Macedonia. Yovon is Macedonia. That's another version of this. And of course, Macedonia is north of Greece, and the idea is over here, Alexander the Great was a Macedonian. So you identify Yovon not just with the Greece over here, but with the northern kingdom of Greece at the time, which itself was a celebrated region called Macedonia. Tevel, we're nearly finished. What's Tevel? So the Gemara says, Tevel, zeh Beit Uniyaki. What's Beit Uniyaki? So the Yerushalmi has this Gemara with different names. And it doesn't say zeh Beit Uniyaki. They say that it is Vatenia. So they want to say it's Bithynia, right? So well, which one are we doing now? Tevel is Bithynia. Meshech zu Musya. Meshach means Musia, so they want to say it's Mysia, M-Y-S-I-E. So we're talking about this part, this sort of, I'm not sure, is this, we're talking here about Yugoslavia and the west of Turkey, something like that. Okay, and finally, Tiras, yes, when it comes to Tiras, says the Gemara, Pligi, there's an argument, Rav Simon Rabbanon, Chad Omar Tirasu Beit Teriaki. Some say that Tiras is Turkey, what we call Turkey over here, and others say Chad Omar Poras, it's Persia. And Tony Rav Yosef was of the opinion Tiras Zu Poras. So after all this long story, we find that Tiras, according to many opinions, is Persia. And since Tiras was descended from Yephes, we have therefore proven that Paras, which is Tiras, is descended from Yephes. So Paras, Persia, who masterminded the building of Bai Sheni, were Bnei Yephes. The Shechina can't rest with Bnei Yephes, even though they have great glory, which is associated with their literature and their philosophy and their creativism. Nevertheless, we can't associate the Shechina. The Shechina will be only in Bais Rishon, because that was masterminded and built entirely by the Bnei Shem, by David HaMelech and Shlomo HaMelech. And here we'll stop, if I can find my stop share button. Okay. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to just stop my recording.